I always thought my daughter-in-law Lily was perfect, polite, helpful, the kind of woman any mother would thank God for. Until that night at dinner. We were halfway through the roast chicken when her phone buzzed. She smiled, excused herself, and slipped into the kitchen, speaking softly in Chinese. She thought no one at the table understood. But I did. Every word. She was calling her lover, arranging a hotel room for that very night. My heart went still. The woman I had trusted with my son's happiness, plotting betrayal, right under my roof, right in front of me. But I didn't confront her. No, I smiled through dessert. Because I knew something she didn't, I wasn't just a grieving old widow. I was a woman who'd built and protected everything this family owned, and I wasn't about to let her destroy it. What I did next would shock the entire neighborhood, make headlines even. By the time the firefighters arrived, Lily would finally understand that some lies stick forever. Stay with me. You're about to hear how one quiet mother-in-law turned betrayal into the most unforgettable revenge you'll ever hear. My name is Betty Collins. I'm 70 years old, a widow, and the former owner of Collins Bakery, the little shop that kept my family fed and our town smelling like cinnamon rolls for nearly 3 decades. It's been 8 years since my husband Edward passed away. He was the kind of man who filled every corner of a room, and when he left, the silence took a long time to get used to. Now my days move slower, gentler. I live in a modest wooden house in suburban Ohio with my son Mark and his wife Lily. The place creaks in the winter and smells of yeast and old wood, but it's home. Every morning I still wake before sunrise, the same habit I kept from my bakery days. I make coffee, knead dough, and hum hymns while the oven warms the kitchen. The rhythm comforts me. It's something I can control in a world that's changed more than I care to admit. When the bread comes out golden, I slice a few loaves, wrap them in paper, and bring them to the church or the neighbors. Some people think it's charity. It isn't. It's just my way of saying, I'm still here. In a quiet house, small acts of kindness become the sound of life continuing. Lily. My daughter-in-law usually joins me in the mornings before she heads to work. She's always so put together. Pressed blouses, neat hair, soft perfume. She has a gentle way about her. Graceful and educated, the kind of woman my son was lucky to find. When she calls me Mom, I still feel a small rush of warmth. She didn't have to love me, but she does, or so I believe. Mark, my son, is steady like his father was. A hard worker, though a little too trusting for his own good. He doesn't talk much about feelings he never has, but I can tell he loves his wife deeply. When he looks at Lily, there's pride in his eyes. And when I see that, I thank Edward quietly, because I truly believe Lily is the last gift he left behind. Our evenings together are simple. We sit down to dinner, say grace, and talk about our days. Lily tells us stories from her job at the marketing firm, clients' deadlines, the busy city life she says she misses sometimes. Mark listens, smiling, though half the time he doesn't understand the jargon she uses. I tease them both for being young and restless while I pour more gravy or pass the bread basket. It feels good, this little world we've built, safe and familiar. Sometimes, though, I notice small things that don't quite fit the picture. Lily's phone lighting up during dinner, her glances toward the screen before she slides it face down. The way she sometimes seems miles away, her smile polite but empty. I tell myself not to read too much into it. She's young. She has her own life, her own worries. The world she grew up in moves faster, louder. Maybe I just don't understand it anymore. On Sundays, I visit the cemetery. The drive there takes 15 minutes through quiet roads lined with maple trees. I bring a loaf of Edward's favorite honey bread, leave it on the bench beside his grave, and tell him about the week. How Mark is doing well at work. How Lily's presentation at her office got her a bonus. I tell him how proud he'd be of them both. Sometimes when the wind rustles the grass, I imagine him answering that deep laugh echoing through the air. It makes the loneliness bearable. There's a comfort in believing you've done your part, that your children are happy, your home is at peace, and life, though smaller than before, is still good. That's what I told myself every day, even when I felt a faint distance creeping into the house, even when I caught a flicker of something unreadable in Lily's eyes. I dismissed it again and again, because love makes you see what you want to see. And for a long time I did. I chose to see the good, the warmth of our dinners, the laughter on Sunday mornings, the smell of fresh bread filling our home. I chose to believe that everything was as it seemed. But peace doesn't last long. Sometimes betrayal hides behind the sweetest smiles. I remember thinking that as I wiped down the kitchen counter that night, listening to the faint hum of the refrigerator and the distant sound of Lily's laughter drifting from the living room. Life in our house felt steady on the surface, 3 people sharing quiet routines and polite affection. But beneath that calm, I had begun to notice a subtle shift. Nothing sharp or loud, just a faint unease, like the feeling of a floorboard creaking beneath your feet where it never used to. At 70, I've learned that peace in a household depends on the small things: courtesy, patience, silence when it's needed. Since Edward died, I'd taken comfort in keeping those things steady. My son Mark worked long hours, and Lily, his wife, filled the house with her polite chatter and easy smile. I thought of her as my companion more than my daughter-in-law. We spent mornings baking together, sharing stories over coffee, laughing about silly things. She called me Mom, and I believed she meant it. That belief began to waver one cool Thursday evening. The sky had gone dark early, the air heavy with spring rain. Lily had just come home, shaking off her umbrella, her cheeks flushed from the cold. She looked lovely as always, that kind of effortless beauty that drew people in. I was finishing up in the kitchen when she set her purse on the counter and her phone buzzed beside it. I'd been looking for a recipe I'd misplaced, the one for Edward's favorite lemon loaf, and when I saw her phone right there, I smiled and asked, "Sweetheart, could I borrow this for a moment? I just want to check something online." "Of course, Mom," she said easily, her voice bright. She handed me the phone and turned to hang up her coat. I started to open the browser, but before I could type a single word, the screen lit up with a new email notification. Just one short line appeared in the preview. "Can't wait to see you tonight." My eyes froze on the message. The sender's name wasn't familiar, and the words, so casual, so intimate, hit me like a sudden drop in temperature. I could feel the blood rush in my ears, a slow, dizzying pulse. Lily turned around just as my hand stiffened. Her gaze flicked to the screen, and in an instant, she moved closer, her smile tightening. "Oh, that it's just a work thing," she said, laughing softly, the sound just a bit too high. "We're finalizing a client dinner. Everyone's exhausted, but we've got to push through." She took the phone gently from my hand, pressing the button to darken the screen. "People joke around too much in emails these days," she added quickly, almost too quickly. I tried to match her lightness, nodding, pretending it was nothing. "Of course," I murmured, forcing a small laugh. But something about her tone, it was off, like a song, played slightly out of tune. She turned to the refrigerator, asked if I needed help with dinner, and the moment passed as if it had never happened. Only it hadn't passed. It stayed with me all night, heavy and unfinished, echoing in the back of my mind. When I lay in bed later, staring at the ceiling, I told myself I was being foolish. The young use hearts and smiles in messages all the time. Maybe it was an inside joke. Maybe it was nothing. But my body didn't believe me. It remembered the way her eyes had flicked too quick, too sharp. The next day, while tidying the dining table, I found a folded piece of paper tucked beneath the mail. I smoothed it open, and there it was, a receipt from the Willow, an expensive restaurant downtown. My husband had taken me there once for our 40th anniversary. I knew that logo, the gold lettering embossed at the top. The date on the receipt was last Tuesday, the night Lily said she'd stayed late at work. 2 entrees, 1 bottle of wine, a dessert for 2. I stared at the paper until the numbers blurred my fingers trembling. I wanted to tear it up to pretend I hadn't seen it. Instead, I folded it neatly and slipped it into my pocket. From that day on, I began noticing things I'd never paid attention to before. The way she angled her phone away when she typed, the way she stepped into another room to answer calls, her voice low and quick, the faint perfume that didn't smell like hers lingering on her coat. Sometimes she came home later than usual, saying she'd had a team meeting. Mark never questioned it. He trusted her completely. I wanted to trust her too, but the doubt had already found a home inside me. I tried to push it down, telling myself stories that made sense. Maybe she was planning a surprise for Mark. Maybe she was helping a friend. Maybe I was just lonely reading too much into harmless things. It's a cruel trick of age. You think you've learned to recognize truth. But sometimes what you recognize is fear. Still, each night as I watched her smile at my son, pour him coffee, kiss his cheek before bed, I felt something inside me tighten. The smile on her face was sweet, but I no longer trusted it. I told myself I was imagining things, that I was letting grief turn me suspicious, that Lily was too kind, too good to betray the family that loved her. But I couldn't shake it. The seed had been planted. And as I would soon learn, it doesn't take much for a seed of doubt to grow roots that reach deep, twisting into every quiet corner of your life. Yet sometimes, the smallest doubt can open the darkest door. That thought followed me into the next day like a quiet shadow I couldn't shake. It lingered behind every ordinary moment, when I stirred my coffee, when I tied my scarf, when I stepped out into the gray morning air. The unease that had started as a whisper now felt like something I carried with me, pressing just beneath my ribs. Still, I told myself to keep moving, to stick to my routines. That morning, Lily offered to drive me to the cemetery to visit Edward's grave. It was something we did together every few months, a small ritual I cherished. I didn't want to refuse, though a part of me wished for silence. The drive was calm, the kind of mid-April afternoon that can't decide between rain and sun. The trees were budding pale green, and the car smelled faintly of Lily's perfume, something floral, faintly sharp. She talked about work, about a new client, who was such a perfectionist about how exhausted she felt, though she smiled through it all. I nodded along, half listening, half somewhere else entirely. Every word she said seemed carefully placed, like pieces in a game I didn't know the rules to anymore. When we reached the cemetery, the wind had picked up. I carried the flowers while Lily walked beside me, her heels clicking softly on the gravel path. We stood before Edward's stone, simple and clean, just as he would have liked. I knelt and brushed away the leaves that had gathered at the base, arranging the flowers neatly. "You'd be proud of them, Ed," I whispered. "Mark's doing so well. And Lily. She takes good care of us." The words caught in my throat before I could finish them. I forced a smile, hoping Lily wouldn't notice. She stood a few feet away, checking her phone, her expression unreadable. The visit was brief. On the drive back, Lily hummed to the radio, while I watched the road ahead, my thoughts tumbling over themselves. We were only a few miles from home when it happened. My purse balanced on my lap, slipped to the floor as Lily turned a corner. "Oh, I've got it," I said, bending down to retrieve it. But as I reached for it, something caught my eye. Beneath the passenger seat, a small tube half hidden in the shadow. At first I thought it was hand cream or lip balm, something ordinary. I picked it up to set it on the console, but the label stopped me cold. It wasn't lotion. It was lubricant. For a long moment, I just stared at it, my breath frozen in my chest. I felt my pulse quicken, heat rising to my face, even as the rest of me went cold. I turned the tube over in my hand, searching for any sign that I was wrong. There wasn't one. I could hear Lily talking beside me something about stopping for milk on the way home, but her voice sounded distant, muffled, like she was speaking from underwater. I set the tube quietly on the seat beside me, my hands trembling. "You dropped something?" Lily asked, glancing over briefly. "No," I said quickly, my voice softer than I meant it to be. I slipped the purse back onto my lap and stared out the window. The rest of the drive was silent. My thoughts were too loud to leave room for words. That night at dinner, I couldn't stop watching her. The house glowed with the same warm light it always had, the table set the same way. Mark's laughter filling the room the way his father's once had. Lily sat beside him, pouring wine, smiling that familiar, graceful smile. She laughed at his jokes, touched his hand gently, and looked at him with eyes that to anyone else might have seemed full of love. But I saw something else now. Or maybe I was seeing what had been there all along. I pushed my food around the plate, my stomach too tight to eat. Every gesture she made seemed deliberate, rehearsed. When she looked at me, her smile was soft, but I felt nothing from it. It was like standing in front of a painting you once adored and realizing it's only paint on canvas after all. Mark didn't notice my silence. He was telling her about a project at work, his face bright with pride. "We're finally ahead of schedule," he said. "I might even get that bonus." Lily leaned in her hand, brushing his arm. "You deserve it," she said sweetly. I wanted to believe her. God, I wanted to believe her. After dinner, they moved to the couch, the television flickering in the background, while they laughed over a show I wasn't really watching. I sat in my chair, pretending to knit my eyes fixed on the soft rhythm of their closeness. That image, Mark happy and unguarded, and Lily smiling beside him, twisted something deep inside me. The tube in my purse felt like it was burning through the fabric, a secret pressing against my conscience. When they finally went upstairs, the house fell silent. I stayed awake long after the lights went out, listening to the creaks in the floorboards, the faint hum of the heater. I couldn't rest. My mind replayed the day, the drive, the label, her voice. I tried to tell myself it meant nothing, that there were explanations, that maybe it was leftover from something harmless. But even as I whispered those excuses into the dark, my body knew better. I sat up, the blanket pooled around my waist, and stared at the shadows stretching across the floor. Somewhere deep inside, the unease hardened into resolve. I didn't know what I would do yet, but I knew one thing for certain: the truth had a way of revealing itself, no matter how well someone tried to bury it. That night, I couldn't sleep. My instincts whispered steady and sure. Find the truth. Those words stayed with me as the hours crept by, the glow of the digital clock, shifting from midnight to 1, then 2, then 3. I lay there in the dark, staring at the faint outline of the ceiling, listening to the soft, even breathing from the rooms down the hall. Mark and Lily were asleep. I wasn't. My mind replayed every moment from the past few weeks. The email, the receipt, the hidden tube. And each time I tried to convince myself I was wrong, the evidence stacked higher until it felt like it was pressing down on my chest. By sunrise, I'd made my decision. I couldn't confront Lily without proof. If I was going to protect my son, I needed more than suspicions and sleepless nights. I needed facts. the kind that couldn't be denied. After breakfast, I waited until Mark left for work before pulling out my address book, its pages yellowed with age. Between the phone numbers for old neighbors and church friends, I found the name I was looking for: Joe Hanley. Joe had been a police detective for 30 years before retiring. He and my husband used to go fishing together every summer, and after Edward died, Joe was one of the few people who still called to check in on me from time to time. I hesitated for a moment before dialing, wondering what I would even say. When his gruff, familiar voice answered, I almost hung up, but the words came out before I could stop them. "Joe, it's Betty. I need your help." He came over that afternoon. Same steady posture, same quiet eyes that seemed to take in everything at once. He sat at my kitchen table while I poured him coffee, just like old times. But this wasn't a social visit, and we both knew it. "What's going on?" he asked gently. I told him everything. The email, the restaurant receipt, the thing I found in the car. I tried to keep my voice steady, but it cracked somewhere between shame and anger. "I can't accuse her without proof," I said finally. "And I can't keep pretending nothing's wrong. She's clever, Joe. Careful. I need to know what she's hiding." He nodded slowly, setting down his cup. "You want me to follow her?" he said. It wasn't a question. Discreetly, I said. "Mark can't know, not yet. I'll handle it," he said. "Give me a week." That week felt endless. Each day moved like it was wading through molasses. I tried to go about my usual routines, baking, visiting the church, calling neighbors. But my mind was never far from the thought of what Joe might be finding. I watched Lily carefully, too. She moved through the house like nothing had changed, humming while she made coffee, chatting with Mark over breakfast, smiling at me as though the world were perfectly ordinary. But every word, every glance felt staged now, like I was watching a play, and she was the only one who knew the ending. By the 7th day, I was unraveling. The tension had turned physical. My hands trembled when I poured tea, and I woke each morning with a knot in my stomach. When Joe finally called, his voice was low and serious. "We should talk in person," he said. He came by that evening just after dark. I met him on the porch, where the porch light cast long shadows across the steps. He didn't waste time. "You were right to be suspicious," he said. "She's been meeting someone, a man named Ryan Collins." For a second, I didn't understand. "Ryan," I repeated, confused. "Mark's friend, Ryan," he nodded. "They've met 3 times this week, always at the same hotel downtown. I've got photos, timestamps." I felt the blood drain from my face. Ryan had been like family. He'd stood beside Mark at his wedding, spent holidays at our house. The idea of him with Lily felt obscene, like something out of a nightmare. "There's more," Joe said, his tone tightening. "I looked into your old bakery accounts just like you asked. Money's been moving small amounts at first, then larger. Transfers into an account under a shell company. And guess who has access to your login credentials?" I didn't answer. I didn't have to. He leaned forward, his eyes sharp. "Betty, this isn't just about cheating. She's planning something bigger. You need to be careful." My mouth went dry. "Planning what?" He shook his head. "I don't know yet." "But she's not doing this alone. That account, there's another name attached to it. Same bank, same pattern. Ryan's." I sat back, the porch light flickering above us. For a moment, I couldn't find the words. My entire world felt like it was tilting, pieces of my life sliding into a picture I hadn't wanted to see. It wasn't just betrayal. It was strategy. Calculation. I looked out into the darkness, the faint hum of cicadas filling the silence. "What do I do?" I whispered. Joe's answer was quiet, but firm. "You don't confront her. Not yet. Let me keep digging. If she's moving money, there's a reason, and I'm guessing it's not just greed. She's after something bigger." When he left, I sat on the porch long after his car disappeared down the street. The night air felt heavy pressing against my skin. Inside, the lights from the house glowed softly through the windows. From where I sat, I could see Mark and Lily in the living room. She was laughing, her hand resting lightly on his shoulder, her face turned toward him with affection, so perfect it almost fooled me. Almost. Because now I knew the truth, or at least the beginning of it. The woman sitting beside my son wasn't who we thought she was. And whatever she was planning, it was bigger, darker, and far more dangerous than anything I dared to imagine. And Joe was right. The betrayal went deeper than she could imagine. Those words stayed with me long after he left, echoing through the quiet of the house like footsteps I couldn't trace. Every time I looked at Lily after that, something inside me recoiled. She was careful, as always. Warm, attentive, even tender. But her kindness had edges, now sharp and deliberate. I moved through my days pretending not to see what I knew. I smiled at her shared meals and said grace at the same table, all while a cold unease pressed down on me. I told myself I needed more time, more proof, before I confronted her. Joe was still digging, and until he brought me everything I couldn't risk alerting her. So I waited, even as my heart burned with the knowledge that my son was living under the same roof as a woman, plotting something against him. I thought I was prepared for anything, but nothing could have prepared me for what came next. It happened on a Sunday afternoon, bright and deceptively peaceful. I was folding laundry in the living room when I heard Lily's voice from the kitchen, soft and trembling. "Oh my God," she whispered, and then I heard it again, louder, breaking apart, with sobs. "Oh my God, no." I rushed in and found her sitting at the table, phone clutched in her shaking hands, tears streaking her face. "Lily." "What happened?" I asked, my heart thudding. She turned the screen toward me. At first, I didn't understand what I was seeing. It was a picture, a grainy hotel room, a man lying half-dressed on a bed, and beside him, a woman in lingerie, her face turned away. But the man's face, my breath caught it, was Mark. Lily covered her mouth as if she couldn't bear to look. "Someone sent me these," she whispered. "An anonymous number." I didn't want to believe it, but her voice broke. "He told me he was working late last Friday." I stared at the screen, disbelief washing over me. My Mark, who had loved her so completely, who had never strayed, never even raised his voice to her. I felt something twist deep inside me, an old pain I hadn't felt since Edward's funeral, the helpless kind that makes your hands shake. "Maybe it's a mistake," I said weakly. "Maybe it's not what it looks like." But Lily shook her head, tears falling fast. I wanted to believe that too. But look, his clothes, his watch, even the ring on his hand. I know my husband, Betty. She buried her face in her hands and wept. I sat beside her, numb, my thoughts tumbling over one another. Could Mark have done this? Could he have betrayed her and us so easily? When Mark came home that evening, I couldn't hold it in any longer. I met him at the door, holding the phone in my trembling hand. "What is this, Mark?" I demanded. He blinked, confused. "What do you mean, these?" I said, thrusting the phone toward him. "Explain them." He stared at the photo's color draining from his face. "Mom, I don't know," he stammered. "That's not what it looks like. I don't remember any of that." "Don't lie to me," I said, my voice breaking. "She's been crying all day. Mark, you've humiliated her." "I'm not lying," he said, desperation rising in his voice. "I swear I don't know who that woman is. I went out for drinks with Ryan that night, and after that it's blank. I woke up the next morning in my car. Someone must have..." Enough, I said, cutting him off. Do you know how that sounds? He ran a hand through his hair, his face pale. Mom, you have to believe me. I wanted to. God, I wanted to. But the photos were right there, undeniable, and Lily sweet, gentle. Lily looked so broken, so betrayed. She didn't accuse, she didn't scream, she only looked at me with eyes full of hurt and said softly, I don't want to leave him, Betty. I still love him. But I can't stay if I don't feel safe. Not after this. That night when the house had gone quiet, she came to me again. Her voice was calm, her tears dried. I've been thinking, she said. If I stay, I need to protect myself. Just something small to feel secure. I know Mark would never hurt me intentionally. But if this ever happens again... She hesitated, as if reluctant. Maybe it would help if the house were in my name. Just for financial security. It's symbolic, really. It would show me that this family still trusts me. It sounded reasonable enough in that fragile, guilt-soaked moment. Mark had betrayed her, or so I thought, and I wanted to make things right. I wanted peace again to fix what was broken. Of course, I said softly. If that's what it takes to keep this family together. The next morning, she brought the paperwork. Everything was already filled out neat and ready for my signature. I hesitated for just a second. The pen heavy in my hand, then signed. I told myself I was doing it for my son, for his marriage, for the peace of our home. But the truth is, I signed because I wanted to believe that good could still come from trust. Lily thanked me with tears in her eyes and hugged me tight. You won't regret this, Mom, she said, her voice trembling just enough to sound sincere. We'll get through this together. That night, as I sat by the window watching the last light fade from the sky, a strange calm settled over me. The papers were signed, the damage I thought was being repaired. I told myself we'd find a way forward. But somewhere deep down, beneath all the reassurance, a small, persistent voice was whispering again, warning me. And the night before the deal closed, I heard something that changed everything. The house was quiet, that kind of heavy, uneasy quiet that settles in after too many days of pretending everything is fine. Mark had gone to bed early. He'd been withdrawn ever since those awful photos, and I couldn't blame him. He'd stopped defending himself and drifted through each day like a man half alive. Lily spent the evening at the kitchen table, her laptop open, reviewing the documents for the property transfer scheduled for the next morning. I told myself it was the right thing to do, that giving her the deed would somehow patch up what was left of our family. But even as I tried to believe it, something deep inside me resisted. I couldn't sleep. I sat by the living room window, watching the orange porch light flicker against the glass. The deed papers were stacked neatly on the counter, signed and sealed. My name, once the foundation of this house, was now just ink on paper. I felt hollow, as if I'd handed over the last piece of myself that still belonged to Edward. Then I heard her voice. Lily's. It floated softly from the kitchen, low, measured, almost musical. At first I thought she was talking to herself, but then I realized she was on the phone. Her tone was light, tinged with laughter, the kind of laughter people use when they think the world has finally bent to their will. He signed it today, she said, her voice bright and gloating. By tomorrow the house will be ours. Ours. Not hers, ours. She paused to listen, then chuckled again, softer this time. Yes, Ryan. I told you it would work. She believed every word I said. The name hit me like a blow to the chest. Ryan, my son's best friend, The man who had spent years in this house, who had called me Mrs. Collins and brought Mark home safely from college parties. I had trusted him, trusted both of them. Lily's tone shifted, playful, almost smug. Even his mother believed me. She actually thinks I'm the one who's been wronged. Then came a cruel little laugh. Can you believe it? That old fool even gave me the house. My hand reached for the wall before I even realized I was moving. The room tilted. My heart thudded painfully in my chest. I wanted to rush in and scream to throw her out right then and there, but I couldn't move. I was frozen, held in place by disbelief so sharp it left me trembling. She kept talking, pacing the kitchen as if rehearsing for a victory speech. Once we get the money, she said, her voice turning soft, almost tender, we'll leave this place for good. You and me, Ryan, just like we planned. Through the speaker, I could faintly hear him laugh, low and confident, a sound that made my stomach twist. Lily laughed too, a light, satisfied sound that no longer belonged to the woman I thought I knew. When she hung up, the silence that followed was suffocating. The hum of the refrigerator was suddenly deafening. My pulse thundered in my ears. I stepped back from the doorway, careful not to make a sound. My whole body was shaking, and yet some part of me, some deep, cold part, was utterly still. A moment later, she turned toward the living room. Her face was composed, serene, the perfect image of the dutiful wife and daughter-in-law. She froze for just a heartbeat when she saw me sitting there in my chair, my knitting in my lap, my face expressionless. Then she smiled, that polished, graceful smile I once thought so genuine. "Oh," she said lightly, pretending surprise. "You scared me, Mom." "Couldn't sleep?" I met her eyes. "No," I said evenly. "I couldn't." "Big day tomorrow," she murmured, walking past me toward the stairs. "You should rest." I watched her climb her steps, unhurried, unbothered, not knowing that I had heard everything. When she disappeared from sight, the tears finally came hot and unstoppable, blurring the room into a haze of shadow and betrayal. I pressed a hand to my mouth, choking back a sob. The house felt colder than it ever had. Every wall, every floorboard seemed to echo with her laughter. But beneath the grief, something else was rising, slow, heavy, certain. It wasn't rage, not yet. It was something deeper, a quiet, deliberate calm. I thought of Edward, of the years we built this home with our bare hands, of the son we had raised with faith and love. I thought of Lily's laughter at our table, her gentle voice when she said grace, her hands that had once felt like family. And then I thought of her voice tonight, cold, mocking, triumphant. I wiped my tears and stood. The house that had once felt like a burden now felt like a battlefield. The papers on the counter were still there, but their power had shifted. My heart was no longer breaking. It was hardening. It was preparing. I looked around the quiet kitchen, at the place where she had spoken her lies so easily, and whispered into the silence, each word sharp and deliberate. I understand every word. That night, I stopped being the victim and began my silent war. The words echoed through my mind long after I whispered them. I sat there in the dark, the soft ticking of the kitchen clock marking the beginning of something new. The woman I had been, the trusting mother, the grieving widow, the quiet peacekeeper, was gone. What remained was something sharper, colder, and far more patient. By morning, my resolve had hardened into purpose. I moved through the house with the same calm rhythm as always, making breakfast, watering the plants, setting the table. But beneath that surface, I was no longer the same. Every motion was measured, deliberate. I was studying Lily now, watching her the way a hunter studies the quiet movement of its prey. She noticed nothing. She smiled and chatted as usual, her voice syrupy sweet, as she poured Mark's coffee and kissed his cheek. I wondered how it felt to play the part so perfectly, to lie so easily to the man who adored her, and the woman who had given her everything. I met her eyes once across the table, and she looked away first. That afternoon when the house emptied and I was finally alone, I called Joe. My voice was steady, but my hand trembled slightly as I held the receiver. "I need your help again," I said. "I know what she's doing now." I heard her. Every word. But if I'm going to stop her, I need proof she can't twist or deny. Joe was silent for a moment, then said simply, "You ready to play this smart, Betty?" "I've never been more ready," I told him. We met that evening at a diner on the edge of town, the same one we used before. The neon sign flickered weakly in the window. The coffee was bitter, and the air smelled faintly of grease. I told him everything, what I'd heard, how she laughed, how she mocked me. Joe listened quietly, his jaw tightening as I spoke. "She's confident," he said finally. "That's good. Confident people make mistakes." He leaned forward, lowering his voice. "If we're going to take her down, we do it clean. No confrontation, no emotion, just evidence." We made a plan. Joe would help me collect what we needed, legal airtight proof. Photos, recordings, financial records. He still had contacts in law enforcement who owed him favors, people who could pull data discreetly, trace accounts, dig into what Lily thought she'd hidden. My role was simpler, but riskier. I would keep her close. I would act the same as before, gentle, grateful, harmless. I agreed without hesitation. "She used lies," I told him quietly, "but I'll use truth." That became my mantra. Every time I smiled at Lily, I reminded myself of it. Every time she thanked me for dinner or asked how I was feeling, I heard the lie behind her words and responded with calm I didn't truly feel. I was polite, patient, pleasant. She had her performance. I had mine. Joe started his work immediately. A few days later, he handed me a small recorder disguised as a key fob. "Start with this," he said. "Leave it where she'll talk. Purse, car, kitchen counter, or anywhere she feels safe." I did exactly that. The first night, I waited until she went to bed and slipped it into her handbag. I remember standing there in the quiet kitchen, the moonlight spilling through the window, my heart beating so loudly, I was sure it would wake her. When I finally placed it inside, I felt a strange calm. I wasn't afraid anymore. I was focused. Joe showed me how to pull the recordings, how to store them safely. Each file was a small victory. Most were meaningless chatter work calls, grocery lists, but every now and then, there was something real. A name, a meeting, a half-whispered word of caution that told me they were still scheming. Meanwhile, Joe began tracing the missing funds. He discovered transfers small at first, then larger, moving through dummy accounts, before landing in one tied to a shell business. It was registered under a false name, but Joe found the link and address belonging to Ryan Collins. The name made my stomach twist each time I saw it, but I didn't let it slow me down. We worked in silence week after week, building a case piece by piece. I gathered photos, Lily's car parked outside the same hotel, receipts from restaurants she'd never mentioned, timestamps that matched the nights she claimed to be working late. Joe's contacts provided corroboration witness statements from hotel staff who'd seen her with Ryan's security footage he managed to retrieve through quiet favors. Each document, each recording, was another step toward justice. At home, I played my role to perfection. I laughed at Lily's small jokes, praised her cooking, even complimented her dress one evening when she came downstairs for dinner. "You always know how to look elegant," I said, and she smiled, pleased, unguarded. I saw then how easy it had been for her to fool us all. People who crave admiration never notice the danger hidden behind it. But something inside me was changing too. I saw it in the mirror sometimes, the softness, leaving my eyes replaced by something colder. Not hatred exactly, but clarity. My warmth had always been my strength. Now it was my disguise. Every night before bed, I spread the collected evidence across the dining table, organizing and labeling it. Photos, bank statements, audio transcripts. I read them like scripture, tracing the story of her deceit until I could recite it by heart. Each new piece made me stronger. Each truth, no matter how painful, gave me power. Mark still had no idea. He went about his days, weighed down by guilt he didn't deserve, and I let him. It wasn't time yet. He needed protection as much as I needed patience. When the truth came out, it would destroy her completely, and I wanted no room for doubt. One night, as I packed the files into a small box and locked it in my bedroom drawer, I caught my reflection again. My face looked older, sharper, but there was something fierce in it now, something alive. I smiled faintly at the woman staring back. She wasn't broken anymore. She was awake. She used lies. I whispered the words, grounding me. I'll use truth. And truth, when ready, cuts sharper than any blade. Those words carried me through the days that followed, steadying me when my hands wanted to shake or my heart began to waver. I woke each morning with a new kind of discipline. The grief that had once drowned me now worked like fuel, steady and precise. I no longer allowed myself to tremble. I had a mission, and it required stillness. From the outside, nothing about me had changed. I still baked my morning bread, still folded laundry neatly in the living room, while Lily scrolled through her phone, still smiled when Mark asked if I was feeling all right. But beneath that quiet routine, I was building something solid, something Lily could never touch or destroy. Every moment she underestimated me. Every soft word I spoke became a stone in the foundation of her undoing. The first step was small, but vital. Joe had given me a tiny black recorder, sleek and simple, that could capture hours of conversation. Keep it close, he'd said. Let her feel safe. The careless ones always talk when they think no one's listening. I waited 3 nights before I made my move. The air was heavy that evening, warm and still, and Lily came home later than usual. She was in high spirits, humming as she set her purse on the kitchen counter. Long day, she said, smiling, her voice light as honey. Clients never stop calling. I matched her smile. You work too hard, dear, I said gently. You'll wear yourself thin. She laughed, tossing her hair. You sound like Mark. Maybe he's right, I replied. When she went upstairs to change, I crossed to the counter, moving with the slow confidence of someone who had done this kind of thing all her life. My fingers found the small inner pocket of her purse. I slipped the recorder inside, pressing the tiny button Joe had shown me. A soft click, then silence. My pulse was calm, my breath even. I stepped away just as she came back down, her perfume trailing ahead of her. She poured herself a glass of wine, talking about some imaginary project at work. Her words a blur I barely heard. I just watched her, watched how easily she lied, how natural it had become. I thought of my late husband, of how proud he'd been of the home we'd built, and I promised him silently that she wouldn't keep it. Not for long. The next morning, after Lily left for work, I retrieved the recorder. Joe and I met at the small diner on the corner where no one knew us. Over coffee, we listened to her voice fill the space between us. She talked about money transfers, about Ryan, about the house. Her tone was light teasing. She was confident, careless. That's what we needed. Joe said, his voice low. That's proof she's involved in the transfers. She's naming him directly. We began to move quickly after that. Joe had contacts in the bank system, people who owed him favors. With their help, we traced the path of the missing money small transfers from my bakery accounts, hidden under codes for supplier payments. The trail wound through several dummy accounts before landing in one linked to a company name that meant nothing on its own Golden Harvest holdings. But Joe smiled when he saw it. "Ryan's company," he said. "Registered 6 months ago." The second piece fell into place soon after. Joe's friend at the hotel, an assistant manager, who remembered him from his detective days, provided access to security footage from the lobby cameras. There they were, Lily and Ryan, walking in together, laughing, their bodies angled toward each other in a way that left no question of what they were. The timestamp matched one of the late work nights she had mentioned. I stared at the screen in silence as the footage played, my hands folded in my lap. Joe slid a printed still across the table toward me. "You want to keep this?" he asked. "Yes," I said simply. "Every brick counts." He smiled faintly. "You're not the same woman I met a month ago." "No," I agreed. That woman didn't know what she was capable of. The work continued quietly, each day a careful step closer to justice. I organized everything, methodically: bank records, recordings, photographs, notes from Joe's contacts. He helped me file reports and prepare witness statements that could stand up in court if it ever came to that. Together, we built a wall of truth, high and strong enough to withstand any of Lily's lies. All the while, I kept my mask in place. At dinner, I laughed at her jokes. I asked polite questions about her day. I even offered to help her prepare for an upcoming business trip. She thanked me sweetly, unaware that I had already seen the hotel reservation she made under a false name. Mark remained oblivious, still wrapped in guilt and confusion, and I let him stay that way for now. He didn't need to carry this burden until the time was right. When it all came to light, it would crush him, but it would free him too. I told myself that over and over. This pain was a kind of mercy. Late one evening, after another long day of gathering files, I sat alone at the kitchen table. The folder in front of me had grown thick-heavy with the weight of truth. I ran my fingertips across it slowly, tracing the edges of each document. Each piece of evidence felt like a heartbeat, steady, powerful, alive. The clock ticked softly in the background. Somewhere upstairs, Lily's laughter floated through the air as she spoke on the phone, her voice muffled but unmistakably happy. I wondered if she was talking to Ryan again, already planning her next move, unaware that her world was closing in around her. I looked at the folder, at the proof I had built with my own hands, and whispered to myself, if you want justice, you must build it brick by brick. And that's exactly what I had done. I stood sliding the folder into its hiding place behind the false panel in my bedroom closet. The air felt charged, almost electric, as though the house itself could sense what was coming. For the first time in weeks, I allowed myself a small smile. The stage was set now. All I needed was the perfect moment. For days, that thought pulsed in my mind like a heartbeat, steady and controlled. Everything I needed was in place: the recordings, the photos, the bank records, the footage. The truth was ready to stand on its own. But truth, I knew, was not enough. Sometimes people like Lily needed to be stripped of their armor, their vanity, their sense of invincibility before they could truly face what they'd done. I wasn't looking for drama or destruction. I wanted her to feel the weight of what she had built with her lies. The opportunity came quietly. Lily was preparing for another business trip, which I knew meant another rendezvous with Ryan. I watched her pack her suitcase one afternoon, humming under her breath, her reflection smiling back from the mirror. She was radiant, proud of her deceit, sure of her control. The arrogance of it made me calm. True arrogance never looks over its shoulder. That evening, after she went out to run errands, I went to work. In the garage, under the faint hum of the fluorescent light, I found the old canister of industrial adhesive Edward had used years ago for repairs. The label was faded, but I remembered its warning clearly. Bonds instantly. Irreversible. I held it for a moment, feeling its weight in my hand. My pulse was slow, my breath steady. I moved through the house quietly, my every step deliberate. In the bathroom cabinet among Lily's carefully organized products, I found what I was looking for, a small discreet bottle. I unscrewed the cap, poured the adhesive inside, and sealed it again. The liquid shimmered slightly thick and unyielding. I wiped the edges clean, replaced it exactly where it had been, and stepped back. Nothing looked disturbed. Nothing at all. As I closed the cabinet, I caught my reflection in the mirror. For the first time in years, I didn't recognize the woman staring back. There was no softness left, no trace of the forgiving mother or the polite widow. There was only focus, cool and absolute. "This isn't revenge," I whispered. "It's justice served cold." I turned my attention to the second part of the plan. The smoke alarm had been Joe's idea. If things go south, we need an alert, he'd said. Something that brings attention fast. Public attention. He'd helped me install a small remote-triggered alarm in Lily's bedroom ceiling, a perfect replica of a real one. With one click on a tiny transmitter, I could set it off from anywhere within a few hundred feet. If the trap worked the way I intended, the alarm would be the final touch drawing eyes witnesses, and most importantly, cameras. The next morning, I met Joe for coffee at the diner. We sat in our usual booth, speaking in low tones over untouched cups. "She's leaving tomorrow," I told him. "Same hotel, same man." He nodded. "You're sure about this?" "I'm sure," I said simply. "It's not about hurting her. It's about ending this." Joe didn't argue. He'd seen too many people like Lily in his years on the force, people who lied and smiled while taking everything from those who trusted them. He slid a small envelope across the table. Inside was a key card to a room near theirs at the hotel. "I've got a camera ready," he said. "Once she checks in, I'll be there." When I got home that afternoon, Lily was in the kitchen scrolling through her phone. "Big trip coming up?" I asked lightly, my voice warm. She looked up startled for just a second, then smiled. "Yes, it's an important meeting. Could mean a promotion if it goes well." I nodded, pretending pride. "I'm sure you'll do great, dear." "You always do." She reached over and squeezed my hand. "You're so supportive, Mom. I don't know what I'd do without you." I smiled back, holding her gaze long enough for the silence between us to tighten. "Just promise me one thing," I said softly. "Be careful. Safe travels." She laughed lightly. "Of course, it's just business." Later, as she packed her final things, I walked into the garage once more. The smell of oil and dust filled the air, and I stood there for a long moment, listening to the quiet hum of the world around me. I thought of Edward, of his steady hands, his kindness, his belief that honesty could fix anything. I wondered what he would think of me now, standing here on the edge of retribution. A part of me hoped he'd understand. Another part prayed he'd forgive me. That night I slept soundly for the first time in weeks. When I woke, the morning was soft and golden. Lily was already dressed, suitcase by the door, her lipstick perfect, her perfume cloying. "Wish me luck," she said, leaning down to kiss my cheek. "Good luck," I replied, my voice calm and measured, "and travel safe." She smiled radiant and unknowing and walked out the door. The sound of her heels faded down the driveway, the engine started, and then she was gone. I stood by the window for a long time after that, watching the road where her car had disappeared. The quiet in the house felt different now. Not empty, not heavy, but waiting. I turned away, picked up my phone and called Joe. "She's on her way," I said. "Understood," he replied. "I'll be in position within the hour." I hung up and set the phone down slowly, my fingers steady. The pieces were all in motion now, every one of them placed with care and patience. I'd done my part. Now the world would do the rest. As I locked the front door and sat at the kitchen table, I looked around at the home I had nearly lost. The walls Edward had painted, the floorboards he'd laid with his own hands, and felt a strange peace settle over me. Whatever happened next, it would be the truth unfolding. Across town, Lily packed her bag and her own downfall. I sat at the kitchen table that morning, listening to the hum of the refrigerator and the ticking of the old clock above the stove. It was strange how ordinary everything felt when something extraordinary was about to happen. The sunlight stretched across the table, catching the edge of my coffee cup, and for a brief moment, I thought of Edward, of how he used to say that peace was the rarest kind of courage. I didn't feel peaceful. I felt hollow, sharp, and ready. Mark came downstairs a little after 8, looking tired. He'd been working long hours trying to distract himself from the mess he thought he caused. His eyes softened when he saw me. "You're up early, Mom," he said, his voice heavy. I smiled faintly. Couldn't sleep. "I was thinking I might go visit Maggie for a few days. She's been asking me to come by. It might do me good to get out of the house." He nodded quickly, grateful for something normal to focus on. "That sounds nice. You should go. You've done enough worrying about me and Lily." I reached across the table and touched his hand. "We all need a little space right now." He smiled, the first real one I'd seen in weeks, and I let myself hold on to that image. My son, still gentle, still trusting. He didn't know yet that I was protecting him from something far worse than heartbreak. I wanted to tell him everything to lift the weight from my chest, but it wasn't time. Not yet. The truth, like justice, had to arrive in its own perfect moment. By late morning, I had packed a small overnight bag, just enough to make the story believable, some clothes, a book, my prescription bottle. I left it in the trunk of my car. Before leaving, I walked one last slow lap through the house, straightening the cushions, adjusting the curtains. It felt ritualistic, almost sacred, like saying goodbye to an old version of myself. When I reached the doorway, Mark appeared again, holding his mug of coffee. "Tell Maggie I said hello," he said, "and don't worry about us. Lily's fine. She just needs time." I smiled. "I know, sweetheart." He hugged me, and I let him. I breathed in the faint scent of his aftershave, the same brand his father once used. It made my throat tighten. "Take care of yourself," I said softly. "I will," he promised. I left the house just before noon, driving toward the next town over. The day was clear and bright, the kind of day that didn't match the weight of what it carried. My hands stayed steady on the steering wheel, though my heart beat faster with every mile. I wasn't nervous. It wasn't that. It was anticipation, the slow, careful rhythm of inevitability. The diner sat across from the hotel Lily had chosen for her business trip. It was an old roadside place with a faded red sign and a bell that rang when you opened the door. I ordered black coffee and a slice of pie I didn't intend to eat, then took a seat by the window. From there, I had a perfect view of the hotel entrance. The parking lot shimmered under the sun, empty, except for a few scattered cars. I kept my phone on the table beside me, waiting for Joe's call. The waitress stopped by once refilling my coffee. "You waiting for someone, hon?" she asked kindly. I smiled. "Yes, someone I need to see." She nodded without pressing, moving on to another table. I appreciated that. It was easier to hide in plain sight when the world believed you were harmless. At 1:42 p.m., my phone buzzed once. Joe's number flashed across the screen. I answered without speaking. "She just pulled in," he said. "Gray sedan." Ryan's car followed a minute later. "They're going in together." "Got it. I replied quietly. I ended the call and reached into my purse for the small remote Joe had given me. My thumb brushed against it. One button, one signal, not yet. Timing was everything. Through the diner window, I watched Lily's car pull into the hotel lot. She stepped out first, her movements graceful, rehearsed. Even from this distance, I could see the way she tilted her head when she laughed, how she brushed her hair back from her face. Ryan joined her, and she took his hand. For a moment, I thought about all the nights she had sat in my kitchen, pretending to care for my family, pretending to be part of us. The betrayal should have burned, but instead I felt only stillness. They walked through the glass doors of the hotel, hand in hand, disappearing inside. I waited, watching the reflection of the afternoon sky in those same doors, watching the ordinary world carry on around them. Cars passing a couple walking their dog, the waitress inside humming to herself as she wiped the counter. It was a perfectly normal day. That's what made it so haunting. I sat there for another half hour sipping cold coffee, pretending to read the newspaper. My body was calm, but inside me something thrummed with electric focus. I checked the small watch on my wrist. If things went according to Lily's pattern, she would be upstairs by now. The door locked, her confidence soaring. She thought she had everything. Joe's second call came at 2:17. They're in. Third floor room 3 and 12. I'll be ready outside the exit when you give the signal. Wait for the alarm, I said. He chuckled softly. Understood. When the line went dead, I leaned back in my seat and exhaled. My heart didn't race. My hands didn't shake. It was strange, the peace that came with purpose. I wasn't afraid of what was coming. I wasn't even angry anymore. It felt as if everything that had once hurt me had burned away, leaving only clarity behind. At 2:25, I stood, left a $10 bill under my cup, and walked outside. The air had grown warmer, the sky a deep, bright blue. I crossed the street slowly, my steps measured, and climbed into my car. From where I parked, I could see the hotel windows' sunlight glinting off the glass. Somewhere inside that building, the final act of her deception was beginning, and with it her end. I sat there in silence, my hands resting loosely on the steering wheel. I thought of Mark again, of his quiet strength, his undeserved shame. I thought of Edward, of the life we built that she tried to steal. My chest tightened, but not with sorrow, with something closer to relief. For so long, Lily had been the storm in my life. Now, as I looked toward the hotel, I realized that the storm had shifted. It wasn't coming for me anymore. And behind that calmness, the storm was ready to break. I sat in my car across from the hotel, hands resting lightly on the steering wheel, eyes fixed on the mirrored glass windows that reflected the afternoon sun. Everything around me felt too ordinary for what was about to happen. The street was quiet. The hum of traffic steady, a mother walking her child across the lot. No one would guess that inside one of those rooms, the final thread of deceit was about to snap. I glanced at the small remote resting in my lap, the button that would bring the world crashing into Lily's carefully built illusion. Not yet. Timing mattered. I looked down at my phone. No messages from Joe, which meant everything was proceeding just as expected. Lily would be upstairs by now, smiling confident, believing she had outsmarted everyone. She would think she'd won. I imagined her laughter, her voice soft and practiced, and for a moment I almost pitied her. Almost. Minutes passed. Then my phone vibrated once. A text from Joe. They're in. My breath steadied. I didn't need to see what came next to know the order of events. I could picture it as clearly as if I were standing in that room myself. The door closing, the whispered words, the silk sheets rustling, and then the first flicker of confusion. The adhesive I had replaced would already be binding invisible, irreversible. There would be a pause, a moment, when realization struck, followed by panic. I could almost hear it, the sudden rise of voices, sharp and frantic, the scraping sound of movement that wouldn't give the disbelief turning to fear. The sound of a lamp crashing to the floor. I didn't smile. I didn't need to. Justice doesn't always arrive with joy. Sometimes it arrives with silence. My phone buzzed again. Another message from Joe. You might want to trigger it now. I pressed the button. A second later, faint through the hotel's walls came the sound of an alarm. Shrill, relentless. The kind that slices through every room and demands attention. I watched as guests began spilling into the parking lot, startled and half-dressed, clutching their belongings. Within minutes, the red lights of the fire truck flashed down the street, sirens, wailing, slicing through the calm afternoon. I sat perfectly still, the noise washing over me like distant thunder. When the fire truck pulled in, I saw him, Daniel Harper, leading his crew. We hadn't spoken in years, not since Edward's funeral. He was broader now, a little grayer, but unmistakable. Joe must have planned it that way. He was the kind of man who still believed in duty, in seeing things through. I watched as they rushed inside, equipment in hand, faces determined. It didn't take long. A commotion followed, then shouts, someone yelling for a medic, someone else cursing in disbelief. I didn't need to hear the words. I knew what they were seeing. The crowd outside began murmuring, phones, raised cameras flashing. A man near the door gasped, pulling his wife closer, and the whispers spread like wind through dry grass. A scandal unfolding in real time. Within minutes, video clips would flood the internet, grainy footage of firefighters forcing open a door, the sight of two people caught together, literally bound, their faces exposed in shock and humiliation. My phone rang. Daniel's voice came through low and stunned. "Betty," he said, almost hesitant. "You wouldn't believe what we just walked in on." "I think I would," I said quietly. He hesitated. "It's bad. The media's already outside. Someone's filming." I closed my eyes for a moment, letting the noise of the sirens blur into the hum of the world outside. The balance had shifted. The lies that had weighed so heavily on my family were crumbling, exposed to light. They couldn't escape. "Do you want me to stop them?" he asked finally. "No," I said, my voice calm, certain. "Let the world see." Those were the last words I spoke before hanging up, and I meant them. By the next morning, the world had seen, and it couldn't stop watching. The news spread faster than gossip ever had. Glued lovers in hotel scandal, the headlines screamed across every local outlet. Reporters stood outside the hotel where Lily and Ryan had been found, their voices hushed but eager. The footage had gone viral overnight. Grainy clips of firefighters storming a room, paramedics rushing in, and two half-covered figures screaming in disbelief. The internet was merciless. Memes, hashtags, late-night jokes. It was everywhere. I didn't watch the videos. I didn't need to. Joe had warned me it would go wide, and it did. But this wasn't about revenge anymore. It was about truth laid bare for the entire world to see. By noon, the hospital parking lot was filled with cameras. I parked a few blocks away and walked in quietly, the manila folder tucked under my arm. My shoes clicked softly on the linoleum floor. As I passed through the long corridor, the smell of antiseptic thick in the air. People whispered when they recognized me. I could feel the eyes following me, the unspoken questions lingering in their stares. Mark was standing outside one of the rooms, pale and disoriented, his hair disheveled, as if he'd been pulling at it. He turned when he heard my steps, his eyes searching my face, For something. Answers, maybe, or understanding. "Mom," he said, his voice raw. "It's all over the news. They're saying—" He trailed off, swallowing hard. "Please tell me it's not true." I looked at him carefully. My son, the man who still wanted to believe the world was fair, that love could be trusted. "It's true," I said softly, "but not everything you've heard is the whole story." He blinked, confusion clouding his face. "What do you mean?" "Let's go inside," I said. The room was dimly lit, curtains drawn halfway to keep out the glare of the reporters outside. Lily lay in the hospital bed, her face turned toward the wall, the sheet pulled up to her chin. Ryan sat nearby, a bandage across his hand, his expression hollow. They both looked small, like children caught in a lie too big to fix. The television mounted on the wall was playing the local news. The anchor's voice carried a hint of disbelief as she repeated the story, showing blurred clips of the hotel footage. Lily flinched at the sound and fumbled for the remote, turning the volume down until the only noise left was the soft hum of the fluorescent lights. When she finally turned her head toward me, her eyes widened. "Betty!" she whispered, her voice thin. "You shouldn't be here." I walked closer, setting the folder down on the small, rolling table beside her bed. "Oh, I think I should." Mark looked from her to me, his brow furrowed. "Mom, please just tell me what's going on." I took a slow breath. My voice was calm, even, but each word landed like a stone dropped into water. "You've been lied to, Mark, for months. She and Ryan didn't just betray you, they tried to take everything from us. The house, the bakery, your father's legacy." Lily's lips parted, but no sound came out. Her eyes darted toward Ryan, who looked away, his jaw tight. I opened the folder and spread the papers across the tray. Photographs, bank statements, printed emails, transcriptions of recordings. Each page was a blade of truth, sharp and undeniable. "These are the transfers from my accounts," I said. "The recordings from her phone. The hotel logs. Every detail of their plan." The silence that followed was thick and unbearable. Even the machines seemed to hold their breath. Mark stared at the documents, his face pale, his mouth trembling. "You," he began, turning to Lily. "You said it was me. You said I—" She shook her head wildly, tears spilling down her cheeks. "Mark, I can explain. I didn't mean—" "It wasn't supposed to stop," I said quietly. My voice cut through the room like a knife. "No more lies." Lily looked at me, then truly looked, and for the first time since all of this began, she seemed to see me not as the quiet, trusting mother-in-law she had fooled, but as the woman who had been watching her all along. Her lips trembled. "What did you do?" she whispered. I met her gaze unflinching. "I told the truth. That's all." The room fell silent again. Mark sat heavily in the chair by the window, his face buried in his hands. Lily turned her face back toward the wall, and Ryan stared straight ahead, his expression blank and colorless. I gathered the papers back into the folder and stood. Now I said, my voice low but steady. "Let's talk about who really cheated." No one spoke. The truth hung between us, heavy and final, like the toll of a distant bell. Outside, I could hear the faint echo of reporters shouting questions, cameras flashing, the world still devouring the scandal it barely understood. The truth was about to surface, and no one would walk away untouched. The silence in that hospital room felt heavier than any sound. Even the steady rhythm of the heart monitor seemed to hesitate, as if the machines themselves understood the gravity of what was unfolding. I stood there, the folder in my hand, while Lily kept her face turned toward the wall. Mark was still seated, staring at the pile of documents spread across the tray table. Photographs, receipts, transcripts, and printouts of emails that no longer allowed for doubt. He reached out his fingers, brushing over one of the pages, then another, as if the truth might change if he looked at it long enough. She did all of this, he asked, his voice small, uncertain, as though he were asking a question he already knew the answer to. I nodded. Every word, every transfer, every lie. It's all here. Slowly, I opened the last folder and took out the translations printed pages of Lily's conversations with Ryan. These are the transcripts from the phone calls she made in Chinese, I said quietly. I translated them myself. You can see the dates, the times. They line up with the nights she said you were cheating. He scanned the first page, then the next, and I saw the color drain from his face. His lips parted, but no sound came out. When he finally looked up, his eyes were full of something I hadn't seen in him since he was a boy. Shame. Not the shame of guilt, but of innocence lost, of having believed the wrong person for too long. "Mom," he whispered, and the word broke. I didn't know. I know, I said softly. I never doubted you. He stood then, his movements unsteady, and before I could say another word, he sank to his knees in front of me. His hands trembled as he reached for mine. "I'm so sorry," he said through tears, "for doubting you, for letting her turn me against you, for everything." I bent down and cupped his face in my hands the way I used to when he was little and scraped his knees. "You don't need to apologize to me, Mark," I said. "You were blinded by love, and she counted on that." Behind him, Lily made a small sound, a choked sob. When I turned, she was looking at me now, her face streaked with tears, her voice shaking. "Betty, please, I made mistakes, I know that. But I never meant for things to go this far. I thought I could fix it before anyone got hurt." "Fix it." I repeated, my tone cold. "You tried to ruin my son's life. You took money that wasn't yours. You laughed about it. You mocked me." She covered her face with her hands. "I'm sorry. I'm so sorry. Please, Betty. Please forgive me." For a moment, I looked at her, the woman who had once sat at my table and called me Mom. I remembered the birthdays, the holidays, the laughter that now felt like another lie. Forgiveness was a beautiful word, but it had to be earned, and Lily had never earned anything honestly in her life. "Forgiveness," I said slowly, "is earned, not begged." Her sobs filled the room, raw and unrestrained, but I didn't move to comfort her. That wasn't my place anymore. Mark turned toward her, his face a mixture of pain and disbelief. "How could you?" he whispered. "I loved you." Lily didn't answer. She just wept harder, her shoulders shaking beneath the thin hospital gown. A nurse opened the door, slightly startled by the sound, and for a moment the hallway beyond came into view. A cluster of people, curious faces, the glow of a phone camera held just a little too high. It took me a second to realize what was happening. Someone was recording. Our confrontation, our pain, our truth, it was all being captured, shared, witnessed. I should have been angry, but I wasn't. The truth deserved light, even if it came from the glare of a stranger's phone. Let them see it. Let them see everything she had done, everything we had survived. When the nurse closed the door again, I gathered the papers into the folder, sealing them inside. "It's over," I said quietly. "The lies, the pretending, all of it. It ends here." Mark stood slowly, wiping his eyes, and nodded. There was exhaustion in his expression, but also something else, relief. He reached for my hand again, and I let him hold it. The bond between us, once frayed by deception, felt whole again. Outside, the murmurs in the hallway grew louder. I knew what would happen next. The story would spread just like the scandal before it. But this time, the truth would carry the weight. People would see the recordings, the documents, the confrontation. They would know. By nightfall, the videos were already circulating online. Strangers commented on my calmness, on the way I had handled her confession, on the line I had spoken that morning. Forgiveness is earned, not begged. It was repeated like a mantra shared across forums and news clips attached to my face in still frames from that hospital room. I hadn't planned to become a symbol of anything. I just wanted justice for my husband's memory, for my son's future, for myself. But now, as I stood in the quiet of that corridor, watching the chaos unfold beyond the glass, I understood that justice had finally begun to move. Justice was coming, and it carried my name. The days that followed felt strangely quiet, as if the entire world was holding its breath. For the first time in months, I woke without the weight of fear pressing down on me. The air in the house felt lighter, though the walls still echoed with memories of everything that had happened. The truth was out now, and there was no taking it back. What came next wasn't revenge. It was accountability. The morning after the confrontation went public, I met with a lawyer named Susan Hayes. She was sharp-composed, the kind of woman who'd seen too many people like Lily and Ryan try to manipulate the system. We sat across from each other in her small downtown office, sunlight streaming through the blinds, casting long lines across the polished wood desk. I handed her the same folder I had carried into the hospital, the one filled with bank records recordings, and proof of every deceit. Susan flipped through the pages methodically. "This is airtight," she said finally. "Fraud, defamation, attempted theft of property. You have everything we need." I nodded, feeling no pride, only a quiet relief. "I just want the truth on record," I said. She smiled faintly. "It already is. Now we'll make it official." Filing the charges felt both heavy and liberating. The courthouse smelled faintly of paper and old wood polish, the clerk's stamp echoing like a gavel each time it hit the page. When I walked out into the cool air afterward, I didn't feel victorious. I felt balanced. The scales had begun to right themselves. The news spread quickly. Local stations that once reported the scandal now turned their attention to the courtroom. Glued lovers face charges. One headline read, followed by another. "Widowed Baker seeks justice." It sounded surreal, even theatrical, but I stayed out of the spotlight as much as I could. The attention wasn't what I wanted, it was the principle. When Lily appeared in court, she looked nothing like the woman who had once walked through my front door with a perfect smile and careful grace. Her hair was unkempt, her eyes red-rimmed, her expression flat with exhaustion. Ryan sat beside her, avoiding everyone's gaze. Their lawyers spoke in hushed tones, trying to soften the damage, but there was no softening the truth. Every document, every recording, every transaction spoke louder than their excuses. Mark sat beside me, through every hearing, his hands clasped tightly in his lap. He never spoke during the proceedings, but I could feel his anger simmering beneath his grief. It wasn't the loud, fiery kind, it was quiet and wounded, the kind that takes years to fade. When the judge finally granted his divorce and awarded him both the house and the bakery, I saw the first flicker of peace return to his face. After the final verdict, Lily was sentenced to probation, restitution, and mandatory community service. Ryan lost his job at the bank, and within weeks, his reputation. People whispered when they saw him in town. No one would hire him. No one would look him in the eye. It wasn't my doing. It was simply the truth catching up to them. A month later, I reopened the bakery. The sign above the door still read Betty's Bread and Blessings, the same name Edward and I had painted there 40 years ago. The ovens had been cleaned, the counters polished, the faint smell of cinnamon returning to the air. On the morning of the reopening, a line of familiar faces formed outside neighbors' church friends, even a few strangers who said they'd followed the story. One of the local news stations asked to do a short interview. I hesitated at first, but then agreed. The reporter, a young woman with kind eyes, held out her microphone as the cameras rolled. "Mrs. Thompson," she said, "after everything you've been through, what message would you want people to take from your story?" I thought for a moment, looking past the camera to the crowd gathered near the window. The same people who had watched my family fall apart and now watched me rebuild. "Truth," I said, "finally always finds its way home." The reporter smiled. "That's beautiful." I nodded, though my heart ached a little. Truth had found its way home, yes, but it came at a price. After the cameras left, I locked the bakery door for a moment and stood in the quiet. The hum of the ovens reminded me of the years Edward and I had built this dream together side by side. I could almost see him there, wiping flour from his hands, grinning as he pulled a loaf from the oven. Mark came in later that afternoon to help with closing. He didn't say much, just washed the trays and wiped the counters. But before he left, he paused by the door. "Dad would have been proud of you," he said. I smiled softly. He'd have been proud of both of us. That night, as I sat by the window with a cup of tea, the town lights flickered across the street like tiny stars. I should have felt complete, but instead there was a stillness inside me, a recognition that some parts of life never return to what they were. The scars of betrayal fade, but they don't disappear. Justice had been served, but even justice cannot heal every wound, only time can. Months slipped quietly into the kind of rhythm I hadn't felt in years. The storm that once raged around our family had finally passed, leaving behind a calm I didn't quite trust at first. The house no longer carried the heavy silence of secrets. It breathed again, filled with the small, familiar sounds of life returning. Mark moved back home not long after the divorce was finalized. He needed something to anchor him, and so did I. The bakery became that anchor. Each morning, we unlocked the doors together, the bell above the entrance chiming softly as we entered. The air always smelled of yeast and sugar, the scent rising from the ovens like a blessing. Mark handled the front counter now, greeting customers with the quiet humility of a man who had been through fire and come out tempered. I managed the baking, the mixing, the endless rhythm of dough and flour. We worked side by side often, without words, but the silence between us was a peaceful one. The regulars had returned, faces I'd known for decades, people who had whispered and speculated and now smiled kindly when they ordered their bread. They didn't need to say anything. Their presence was enough. By spring, business was better than ever. Maybe people came out of sympathy at first, but soon they stayed for the bread, the pies, the sense of warmth that filled the place. Some even said there was something different about the taste, now richer, more alive. I think they were right. Peace has a way of changing everything it touches. One quiet Sunday after closing up shop, I packed a small basket with a fresh loaf still warm from the oven and drove out to the cemetery on the edge of town. The sun was low, turning the rows of headstones gold. I parked beneath the old oak tree and walked slowly to Edward's grave. The stone was simple, just his name and the dates, but the words beneath still caught my throat every time "beloved husband, steadfast heart." I knelt down, brushing a few fallen leaves away, and placed the loaf beside the flowers I'd brought. "I did what was right," I whispered. "For Mark. For you. For us." The breeze lifted slightly, carrying the faint scent of grass and earth. I closed my eyes and let the quiet hold me. For a moment, I could almost hear his voice, steady, patient, proud. I smiled through the ache in my chest. I knew he would have understood. Lily was gone. She left town quietly after the sentencing, no farewell, no trace. I heard she sold what little she owned and moved west, maybe to start over. I didn't hate her anymore. Hatred had no place left in me. She had already taken enough of my energy, my trust, my time. Some people were lessons, not losses. She had been both. Life moved forward in the simplest of ways. The bakery thrived. Mark healed, and I found comfort in small things. The hum of the mixer, the rustle of newspaper on the porch, the smell of cinnamon rolls cooling by the window. Each day was proof that survival wasn't about strength or anger. It was about endurance, about choosing to stand again even when the ground had been pulled out from under you. On warm afternoons, I spent time in the garden behind the house. The roses Edward had planted years ago were still blooming pale pink and soft as memory. I'd sit with a cup of tea, the sun warming my hands, and listen to the sound of the world continuing. Birds in the trees, laughter from the neighbors' children, the low hum of cars passing in the distance. Everything ordinary, everything precious. Sometimes people still recognized me when I went into town. They'd stop me to say how strong I was, how brave, how they admired what I'd done. I always smiled politely, but bravery had nothing to do with it. I hadn't been fearless. I'd simply refused to let lies define me. There's a difference. One evening as twilight settled over the backyard, Mark joined me on the porch. He brought 2 mugs of coffee and handed me one before sitting down beside me. For a while, we just watched the sky shift from gold to purple, the air growing cool around us. "Do you ever think about her?" he asked finally. I took a slow sip, considering. Sometimes, I said, but not with anger anymore. He nodded, looking relieved. Me too. We sat in silence again, both of us staring at the fading light. The pain hadn't vanished completely, but it no longer ruled us. It had turned into something quieter, something manageable, a scar rather than a wound. I thought about everything we had lost and everything we had managed to keep. Our family, our dignity, ourselves. I turned to Mark and smiled. "You can lose everything," I said softly, "but never lose yourself." He smiled back, and for the first time in a long while, his eyes were clear. When he went inside, I stayed a little longer, watching the last of the sunlight slip behind the trees. The air smelled of fresh bread drifting in from the kitchen, and I felt something gentle settle in my chest. Not victory, not vengeance, just peace. Because in the end, the sweetest revenge is peace. And that was my story, a story about betrayal, truth, and the kind of justice that doesn't come from anger, but from courage. If you've stayed with me until the end, thank you. Stories like this aren't just about revenge, they're about remembering that no matter what life takes from you, you can always take back your strength. I'd love to know what you think. Do you believe Betty was right to do what she did, or do you think forgiveness would have been the better choice? Tell me in the comments. I read every one, and I'm always curious how each of you sees the story. If you enjoyed this journey and want to hear more stories like this about family justice and the quiet power of truth, make sure you subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications so you don't miss the next one. Every week, I share new stories that remind us that life, no matter how broken it gets, can still find its way back to light. Thank you for listening, for feeling with me, and for keeping these stories alive. After all, they only matter when they're shared with hearts like yours.